Greg Bakun here. I've been talking for a while about how spooky, fun, and fascinating the Minneapolis trolley tours are, but now there's big news. The Candlelight Ghost Tours now begin at the historic Pillsbury Club, a beautifully restored haunted mansion once owned by Charles Pillsbury himself. Believe it or not, the interior is nearly 200 years older than the exterior. How is that possible? You'll have to come out and find out. Before or after your tour, stop by the on-site market featuring a curated collection of handmade goods, artisan crafts, and locally inspired treasures. Perfect for picking up a keepsake to remember your haunting adventure. You'll also find exclusive spooky merchandise from Tales of the Crypt and Elvira. Then, climb aboard the climate-controlled trolley as we travel through Minneapolis' haunted hotspots, uncovering ghost stories that locals would rather keep buried. The mansion is restored to perfection, and there is no better way to spend an evening. Visit MinneapolisTrolleyTours.com for tickets and more information.
The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host, guest, random reptoid, or chupacabra may not necessarily reflect those of AM 950 Radio, its affiliates, or its sponsors. Now, it's time to step into the unknown. There are things people experience but never talk about. A shadow moving in the corner, flickering of the lights, a disembodied voice. We invite you to talk with us. Share your story, share your experience, because this isn't just your story. This is our story. This is GhostBox Radio with Greg Bakun.
And this is GhostBox Radio on AM 950, where every night we talk about the paranormal, ufology, Bigfoot, and so much more. Everyone, hope you're having a happy Lincoln's birthday, because as we are airing this tonight, it is Lincoln's birthday, and I have wanted to bring someone on for a very long time, and I read a lot of books for the show, and there are so many great books, and I am blessed that I'm able to read so many, but one has stayed with me for a couple years now, and I really wanted to be able to get our guest on tonight. And the thing with our guest is that, he's a busy man. He has a lot going on. He keeps writing books. He keeps doing events. He keeps, doing podcasts. So it's the fact that we're able to get him on at all is very exciting. And I am just thrilled to welcome Troy Taylor to the program tonight. And if you don't know Troy, you're going to want to kind of see what he does. And you can go over to AmericanHauntingsInc.com. There you're going to be able to see the books and the other people that write books there, as well as events, everything else, newsletter, podcast. It's really great, but I wanted to focus tonight on a book, like I said, that I read 2 years ago, and I'm a slow reader. I try not to be, but I am a slow reader, and this was worth taking the time to read, because it is it's so layered, has so much information in it. The book I'm talking about is One Night in Washington: The True Story of America's Most Haunted President. We're talking about President Abraham Lincoln today. Troy, welcome to GhostBox Radio.
Hey, thanks for having me on. So I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you. And I read this book, and here's the thing about it, folks, that I just love about it is that, you could easily have just gone to the highlights of maybe the paranormal stuff, everything else, but you give such a background to the life of Lincoln. And I think what's important about that is that all that really plays into is the stuff that comes later in his life. You're showing us the making of this president and the making of this man, and the detail. It's just amazing, the detail that you can find about Abraham Lincoln.
Well, I grew up in Central Illinois, so I spent a good part of my life in an area where he lived, not necessarily grew up, but spent an awful lot of his years. And so I've always been fascinated with Lincoln. And it was a story that I wanted to tell as in-depth as possible, because for one thing, I write a lot about history, but I try to write about the history that isn't what you're going to read in, a school book, or, especially something that you're going to read about Lincoln in a mainstream history book, because mainstream writers about Lincoln, and I understand where they're coming from. They want to write about, his political life, how he became, interested in the abolition of slavery and that kind of thing. And while all of that is important, there are so many other elements to his life that are unusual, that are strange. And, when I say America's most haunted president, I don't think it's any exaggeration, because this is a guy who grew up surrounded by, his mother's family were involved in folk magic. And these are the kinds of things he grew up knowing about, believing in, the superstitions, the traditions that came with it. His mother dies at a very young age, and, and sort of abandons him. And then, he gets a new stepmother who is practically his best friend. And all these things shaped his life. The accident that happened when he was a boy that almost killed him, that's something that I think plays a very big part in, what happened to him in the years to come. I mean, there's no way we can know that, Lincoln's melancholy, or even his psychic visions that he would later describe himself to other people. This isn't something that, we've just kind of conjured up out of thin air. There's no way to know if they were the result of him nearly dying as a boy, but there's a chance they were. There's a very good chance this affected his entire life. I mean, I think there were so many things that affected, his belief systems and what he would go on to do in his life that happened in the early years. And even, after he had become a lawyer, these were things that I think were so important. And I wanted to make sure that the full story was told.
Death is a very big part of his life. Do you think even more so for Lincoln, or is that the period of time? Death, there's so much that we know now about diseases and whatnot that we didn't back then, but it just seems like Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln certainly had a very tragic life.
Yeah, for sure. And, with Lincoln, as I mentioned, losing his mother the way that he did, and there was always a rift later between he and his father, where he and his stepmother were very close. He and his father never really were. And maybe that was a product of the time too. But he also saw, there were a number of deaths in his life that really left an effect on him, according to his friends, his biographers. Maybe Lincoln didn't talk about, too much about, losing Anne Rutledge when he was living in New Salem. And as he was trying to become an attorney, and, a lot of people will not necessarily dispute the story, but they'll play down the importance of it. But yet his friends and biographers who knew him personally, these aren't guys just going back writing a book, they knew how it had an effect on him, and it would continue to have an effect on him. And then, of course, he and Mary lost one of their sons early, and then lost another son in the White House, which really had an effect on Mary, more so than I think anything else ever did. And living under the pressure, in that pressure cooker of the White House, that they were living in at the time. And it was extremely, as everyone knows, I don't need to tell them how volatile this time in our, nation's history this was, with the Civil War. And then they lose Willie, and Mary just became unhinged. And I think that, I think she probably had issues that we would I think they probably both had issues we would diagnose now that no one could diagnose back then.
Sure.
Whether, it was some sort of manic depressive type thing, or it's impossible to say, exactly what was going on. And I know a lot of people have tried, but I don't think there's any way we can know for sure. But I'm sure that was part of the, Lincoln was always described as having melancholy, which was, in the mid 19th century, that was just kind of one of those toss-up words for people who are sad. Now we call it depression, and probably deep chronic depression on Lincoln's part. But back then, he was a sad guy. Well, of course he was. I mean, he'd seen a lot of tragedy in his life, and he was trying to steer a country through a war that, for the first couple of years we were losing,
Yep.
and so that made a huge difference in everything about them. So tragedy played a huge role.
Lincoln seemed awkwardly unawkward, if that makes any kind of sense.
It absolutely makes sense, because most people mistook him for this gangly frontiersman, which he was. I mean, This was a guy who knew how to relate to people. I mean, he really was a rail splitter. I mean, that's how he made extra money. These were the things he hired out to do, on neighbors' farms. And so he worked outside. He was strong. He was a champion wrestler at a time when wrestling had nothing to do with costumes and rings. It was beating the hell out of each other, you know, and in a good natured kind of way, usually. But there were lots of times when he was involved in angry confrontations and street fights. And this was a guy who many mistook for being kind of this, they look at him and, they see this man who stands 6'4", which was much taller than the average man at the time. He towered over everybody. He was unusual looking. I mean, he just was. I mean, and he knew it. Yeah. He knew he was. And newspapers would describe him as looking like a gorilla and all kinds of horrible things they would say about him. And, they would picture him just being kind of a dumb farmer. And instead, he was well-read. He was extremely intelligent and knew about politics. He knew about law, and he knew about, religion and, anything you could possibly imagine. He'd read a book about it because that's all he had to do in many occasions. When he was a kid growing up, his stepmother had encouraged him to read everything he could get his hands on, and it paid off in life. And so he was an awkward looking man. And, he would show up in meetings at the White House and take his shoes off and put his feet up on the table. And these are things that people didn't do in polite society, but he didn't really care. And I think he often played up that image, because he knew that people thought they could take advantage of him, and they actually couldn't. And it was always to his benefit.
It's and one thing that I really liked about the book and reading about Lincoln before we get into anything paranormal and supernatural is the fact that, the Lincoln that you see as a young boy is the same Lincoln that goes to the White House. There doesn't seem to be any sort of, changing of not even opinion, but kowtowing perhaps to any majority sensibilities. And that, that really shows that the character of Lincoln was a consistent and strong one.
Yeah, absolutely. He was always someone that people knew that they could talk to about anything as far as intelligence wise goes. I mean, he would, deliver speeches and things standing on a tree stump. This was a guy who had a lot of his belief system shaped early on. He went down to New Orleans with his cousin. One of the first things he did as an adult, a young adult. And his cousin always believed that that's what shaped his belief, not only in perhaps prophecy when it came to the paranormal, but also his belief in slavery and the fact that it was wrong, because he saw the slaves in chains for the first time really in his life, saw these groups of slaves working on the wharfs in New Orleans or, being led by chains and sold at auction. And that had an effect on him. And, he came home and he moved to, New Salem, this little village that was just kind of getting started, ran a store, became a postman, one of those guys that everybody knew you could count on, and became an attorney. And, the people whose cases he represented at trial, including a couple of fairly famous, at least in backwoods Illinois, famous murder trials, and so there were people whose lives he literally saved on many occasions, and they were happy to see a guy like him go to the White House. But, the thing you have to remember is, he won on a minority because there were, of course, again, you can look at that and say, well, he didn't win the popular vote. That's because no one did, because back then, like 10 guys ran for president at the same time.
Sure.
But he had all the votes that he needed. And, people were a little shocked, that this is who they were putting in the White House, until they realized that he was a genius and he knew what he was doing, and a lot of that he would credit to his beliefs in the supernatural, believe it or not. These were things he never shied away from talking about or admitting.
It's incredible. Before we head off to break here, I just want to say one of the things too that was surprising to me, and not in the supernatural realm once again, is the sheer amount of stuff Lincoln did for a living or for his life before he became president. It seems like it's 5 lifetimes.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, the travels that he made, and then, he was a soldier in the Black Hawk War. He ran a store. He was a postmaster. He, became an attorney. Back then, you had to read several books. That's what made you an attorney. But he did it. He did everything he needed to do. So.
Gosh, it's just amazing. Why don't we go ahead and do this? Let's take our first break. When we come back, let's get into the supernatural side of things, and also want to talk a little bit about the climate of the time, because I think it plays a big part, especially for Lincoln to get to Washington. You're listening to GhostBox Radio on AM 950. Okay, quick question. What do UFOs, breathwork, and psychedelics have in common? Find out at the Midwest first-of-its-kind consciousness experience, the Contact Modalities Expo, back for year 2, May 1st through 3rd in Wisconsin. This is not a lecture, it's an experience. 4 stages, all happening at once, world-class experts, hands-on, mind-expanding sessions all weekend long. Hosted by Jimmy Church, UFO Skywatches with Chris Bledsoe, telepathy, quantum hypnosis, ancient mysteries, try telekinesis, use dowsing rods, experience the God helmet, even a live seance. But there is so much more. Curious? Perfect. Already deep in it? Even better. Go beyond the limits of what you thought was possible. The Contact Modalities Expo, May 1st through 3rd. Get the details now at contactmodalitiesxpo.com. Greg Bakun here. Like you, I love good, fresh, delicious food. So I want to tell you about this treasure in Roseville called Maverick's Real Roast Beef. Maverick's has the best roast beef sandwiches I've ever had. Made fresh every order. Add fries or onion rings dropped in the fryer when ordered, and you have a winning combination. Maverick's Real Roast Beef has a lot more than roast beef, so check out their website, mavericksbeef.com, or check out their restaurant on Lexington in Roseville. Greg Bakun here. I've been talking for a while about how spooky, fun, and fascinating the Minneapolis trolley tours are, but now there's big news. The Candlelight Ghost Tours now begin at the historic Pillsbury Club, a beautifully restored haunted mansion once owned by Charles Pillsbury himself. Believe it or not, the interior is nearly 200 years older than the exterior. How is that possible? You'll have to come out and find out. Before or after your tour, stop by the on-site market featuring a curated collection of handmade goods, artisan crafts, and locally inspired treasures. Perfect for picking up a keepsake to remember your haunting adventure. You'll also find exclusive spooky merchandise from Tales of the Crypt and Elvira. Then, climb aboard the climate-controlled trolley as we travel through Minneapolis' haunted hotspots, uncovering ghost stories that locals would rather keep buried. The mansion is restored to perfection, and there is no better way to spend an evening. Visit MinneapolisTrolleyTours.com for tickets and more information. Greg Bakun here. It's nice to get out of the Twin Cities and take some travel excursion to some great locations. Minnesota has so much to offer, which is why I love traveling down to Wabasha and staying at the historic Anderson House Hotel. Opened in 1856, this beautiful hotel offers comfortable accommodations, has a delicious restaurant, and even a speakeasy in the basement to unwind with a drink. Located next to the Mississippi River and on Main Street, there is a lot of sightseeing and shopping to do too. To get more information, go to theandersonhousehotel.com. And welcome back to GhostBox Radio on AM 950. My name is Greg Bakun. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'm having a great conversation, and I've been wanting to have this one for a very long time. And tonight we have author, researcher, lecturer, he's podcaster, he's an everythinger, Troy Taylor. And you got to go over to AmericanHauntingsinc.com. and there you can find out about haunted history, books, tours, events, all that stuff. And tonight I am being selfish and I want to talk about the book One Night in Washington, the true story of America's most haunted president, that you can get on the American Hauntings books, or it's actually AmericanHauntingsBooks.com, but you can also, I think, Troy, we can get to it through AmericanHauntingsInc.com, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's kind of the main clearinghouse that sends you everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
You were listing all the things I did, and I'm starting to sound like Abraham Lincoln now.
You are.
Yeah, too many jobs.
It's yeah. Well, and here's the thing too. It's like, you know, someone might wrongly think you wrote a book or two, and that is not the case with you. How many books have you written?
Well, I've got 151 that have been out since the end of the year. I had one come out in November, so.
I haven't even read 151 books. I probably have. I'd like to, well, for the sake of radio, I'll pretend I have.
I'll bet you have.
Yeah. We're talking, it's Lincoln's birthday today, and we're talking about, I mean, clearly, Troy, you've always admired, been a fan of Lincoln. I have as well. I want to talk a little bit, because I think this plays into just in current, and I'm not getting into current politics, but I mean, I think one of the things that was almost sobering for me and actually helped me just in whatever side life is, it's tumultuous for everybody, I believe, at the moment, and it has been for some time. Like the lengths Lincoln had to go to travel to Washington for his own inauguration for his first term. That's actually, to me, very scary about how early on we might have lost him.
Yeah. It's you know, we talk about the country being divided, and I don't think we can even compare today to how it was at you know in 1860. This was a time where, you know, the fight against slavery and the battle between the North and the South, it really hadn't erupted into war, but the division between people and the way half of the country felt about the other half of the country, and how half of the country felt about Abraham Lincoln. It may have been more than half the country, because I'm sure there were other people, even in the North, who were not fans of Lincoln's. And getting to Washington was not just, you know, it wasn't something you'd jump on a plane and zip over for your inauguration. I mean, not only was it a long train ride, but Lincoln had already planned this route, and they had wanted to really make it a celebratory thing and try to kind of bring the nation together. And instead, the number of death threats and warnings that were received by the time that Lincoln got, you know, to Baltimore, you know, there were huge fears that he was in big trouble and that someone would kill him before he ever got there. And they literally had to sneak him into Washington just to get him to the Capitol. They had to go in disguise. A future Secret Service agent, a woman, actually kept him alive the entire way. And, you know, she pretended that he was her invalid father, and they just sort of smuggled him into the city. And, you know, of course, that then made him a target to, you know, for derision by his enemies. But I think at that point, most people realized that things were bad and were going to soon get worse, as they did. And, you know, within a month of the inauguration, you already had, you know, things happening at Fort Sumter, and the nation was at war. So Lincoln never even had a chance really to govern our country when it wasn't at war, because as soon as the war ended, of course, he was assassinated. But he did rejoin the country. And I think that things might have even have been a lot different if Lincoln had not been assassinated. And the way that he envisioned bringing the country back together was not what happened afterward, when, you know, a lot of the people who, you know, had been on his side wanted revenge. They didn't want to join things. And I think we're still suffering. Honestly, I know it was a long time ago, but I think we're still suffering from that today. I really do.
We certainly are.
Yeah.
All you have to do is, and I don't think so much being in the North, but just going to the southern states, you get that is a scar that is very deep.
Yes, absolutely.
And I and I just say I appreciate that. I mean, that's their lives. That's how they. I mean, it's just people are brought up a certain way, and
Right.
that's that's what they've had. Just like on our end, this is how
Right.
we've been brought up.
Right. Right.
Now, what am I wrong to think that the popular narrative has always been that Lincoln did not believe in supernatural, only Mary Todd did, like the popular narrative, because that clearly is not the case.
Right. No, that is the mainstream history version of things. And even then, people will talk about Mary's belief in the spirit world and her attending seances and things like that as a sign that she was insane. They will use the fact that she did spend some time in an insane asylum, but I don't think that had anything to do with her belief in spiritualism. I think that had more to do with, I think issues she'd had throughout her life, and things were when pressure would pile up on her, and then Tad died. And then, Robert her oldest son had little choice but to do something to try and help her. And that's not the way she took it. But yeah, to get back to it though, Lincoln had a belief in the supernatural his entire life.
Mm-hmm.
He'd been raised that way. I mean, it was something that his family in Kentucky had believed in. It was something that stuck with him in Indiana. And it was part of his life in Illinois, long before Mary was ever involved with spiritualism. And the thing is that to correct this, falsehood about Mary and her husband by extension, spiritualism, got its start in the late 1840s and was a national fad. It was a huge movement across the country, especially during the war, when so many people were losing loved ones. Well, this was a way to talk to them again. And so spiritualism was something followed not by, crazy people and lunatics like they try to paint Mary as being, but this was everybody. There were millions of spiritualists in the country at the time. There was a huge community in Washington of some of the most esteemed members of society in the city. Lincoln's generals, many of the people who worked for him were believers in spiritualism and regularly attended seances. And according to many of them, their private diaries, letters they wrote, even a book by Mary's favorite spiritualist, Nettie Maynard, Lincoln also attended the seances. Now, whether he attended because of Mary, that's entirely possible, but she recounts a lot of private conversations that she had with Lincoln about his own beliefs. And we know that he had them because he often talked about them, going all the way back to election night in 1860, when he had that vision of seeing two faces in the mirror. And, his interpretation that Mary gave him was that, he would be elected twice to be the president and would not survive his second term. I mean, that was something that she believed. He didn't know. He saw it as what it was. He believed it was some sort of vision. And he probably thought it was a really far-fetched explanation too, because another thing to remember is at that time in history, no president had ever been elected to a second term. Lincoln was the first. No one else ever had been. So that was something that he didn't even know would ever happen. And so, the fact that he did attend all these seances, things is largely ignored by, again, mainstream history.
Well, and I also think too that isn't it also to be said that there was a lot of spiritualism in at the time, but there's also a lot of fraud. So to try to find the right and a believable person, I think was something that a lot of people probably ended up being taken for.
Yeah, and that's sort of the sad thing about what happened to Mary, because in the early days there was some fraud. I know that there was. I mean, I've studied that. I've written books about spiritualism, and so I know that in the 1850s and 60s there was fraud already, and it would get worse as the years went by. And as I mentioned, that's kind of the sad thing about Mary, is she really got taken advantage of in the 1870s by a lot of the fraudulent psychics and mediums that were out there. But there were plenty who, seemed legitimate, or at least, were portrayed as legitimate. And so when Willie died, when their son Willie passed away during the war in the White House, as I mentioned earlier, Mary just sort of became unhinged. And spiritualism provided her with a lot of comfort, as it did a lot of other people.
Yep.
And I think that might have been the time when Lincoln himself perhaps was involved a little less with spiritualism, because Mary was so devoted to it that I think maybe he stepped back a bit, but not completely, because there are still accounts written by other people who experienced it of Lincoln having these prophetic, almost psychic dreams. A lot of his encounters with what we would term the supernatural came through dreams, which is, that's something that dates back to biblical days, something Lincoln would have been well aware of. And, his dream about, finding the president had been assassinated a couple of weeks before he was assassinated. And again, that's not something that was common. He didn't have a secret service at the time. The only protection that it was thought Lincoln needed was mostly by soldiers and by a couple of his old friends from Illinois who put together a protective detail, they thought, because perhaps, one of the enemies, a Confederate spy, would be the one who might try to get Lincoln. And so no one ever thought that he would be assassinated by another citizen, especially one that was as well known as John Wilkes Booth was at the time.
Right.
I mean, he was a big celebrity, and he's the one who committed the murder, and no one saw that coming. And so, the Secret Service that Lincoln ironically signed into being, all it did was, chase counterfeiters at the time. It didn't have anything to do with protecting the president. So Lincoln had this dream of an assassination, which he probably, while bothered by it, dismissed it, because that wasn't something that was going to happen. No presidents had been assassinated up to that point. And, in fact, his closest bodyguard, he sent him on an errand to Richmond on the night that he and Mary went to the theater, never thinking that he'd ever need protection. And of course he did, as it turned out, but
unbelievable. I mean, and the pieces that are laid out prior to his assassination, it almost is like the parting of the waves, in a sense. Like, this is like a fixed point in history, and that nothing that's going to happen is going to change this trajectory for Abraham Lincoln.
No. Yeah. Well, and that was the thing. He was always a great believer in fate. I mean, that was one of the reasons why he would skip out away from his bodyguards that he did have, and, would decide to go out for a carriage ride. And, his friend Ward Layman would almost weekly resign from his job at the White House because he would be so angry at his old friend that, Lincoln he quit because he wouldn't take his protection seriously. And then Lincoln would have to talk him back into coming back to work, always with the promise of, oh, well, don't worry, I'll take it more seriously from now on. But he never did. And so, Lincoln believed in fate. He believed that his story was already written. And if he was going to be killed by an assassin or die from a disease or from an accident, then that's the way it was. I mean, that's how it was going to be. And so that I think really kind of informed how he looked at life during those years in the White House, and, how he ended up being killed the way that he was, unfortunately.
There's so much left that I want to get to. Why don't we go ahead? We're going to try that again. I don't know my audio levels. I'm not using my normal board. Let's go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we have a lot more questions for Troy Taylor. You're listening to GhostBox Radio on AM 950. Okay, quick question. What do UFOs, breathwork, and psychedelics have in common? Find out at the Midwest's first-of-its-kind consciousness experience, the Contact Modalities Expo, back for Year 2, May 1st through 3rd in Wisconsin. This is not a lecture, it's an experience. 4 stages, all happening at once, world-class experts, hands-on, mind-expanding sessions all weekend long. Hosted by Jimmy Church, UFO Skywatches with Chris Bledsoe, telepathy, quantum hypnosis, ancient mysteries. Try telekinesis, use dowsing rods, experience the God helmet, even a live seance. But there is so much more. Curious? Perfect. Already deep in it? Even better. Go beyond the limits of what you thought was possible. The Contact Modalities Expo, May 1st through 3rd. Get the details now at contactmodalitiesxpo.com. Greg Bakun here. Like you, I love good, fresh, delicious food. So I want to tell you about this treasure in Roseville called Maverick's Real Roast Beef. Maverick's has the best roast beef sandwiches I've ever had. Made fresh every order. Add fries or onion rings dropped in the fryer when ordered, and you have a winning combination. Maverick's Real Roast Beef has a lot more than roast beef, so check out their website, mavericksbeef.com, or check out their restaurant on Lexington in Roseville. Greg Bakun here. I've been talking for a while about how spooky, fun, and fascinating the Minneapolis trolley tours are, but now there's big news. The Candlelight Ghost Tours now begin at the historic Pillsbury Club, a beautifully restored haunted mansion once owned by Charles Pillsbury himself. Believe it or not, the interior is nearly 200 years older than the exterior. How is that possible? You'll have to come out and find out. Before or after your tour, stop by the on-site market featuring a curated collection of handmade goods, artisan crafts, and locally inspired treasures. Perfect for picking up a keepsake to remember your haunting adventure. You'll also find exclusive spooky merchandise from Tales of the Crypt and Elvira. Then, climb aboard the climate-controlled trolley as we travel through Minneapolis' haunted hotspots, uncovering ghost stories that locals would rather keep buried. The mansion is restored to perfection, and there is no better way to spend an evening. Visit MinneapolisTrolleyTours.com for tickets and more information. Greg Bakun here. It's nice to get out of the Twin Cities and take some travel excursion to some great locations. Minnesota has so much to offer, which is why I love traveling down to Wabasha and staying at the historic Anderson House Hotel. Opened in 1856, this beautiful hotel offers comfortable accommodations, has a delicious restaurant, and even a speakeasy in the basement to unwind with a drink. Located next to the Mississippi River and on Main Street, there is a lot of sightseeing and shopping to do too. To get more information, go to theandersonhousehotel.com. And welcome back to GhostBox Radio on AM 950. My name is Greg Bakun. Thank you very much for joining us on Lincoln's birthday, and I am really excited. I've been enjoying this conversation about the book written by Troy Taylor, One Night in Washington, the true story of America's most haunted president. And once again, please go check out AmericanHauntingsInc.com. You can find all the books that Troy has written and also all the events and stuff. And, you know, part of it, too, is you might be like, well, we haven't really talked about the assassination a whole lot. And that's because I think it's a really good reflection of the book, because the book does talk about it a lot, but it does take its time to get there and needs to, because I think you do need to know all about this pre-story. There's so much more instead of just talking about the one night in Washington. Real fast, Troy, do you think Abraham Lincoln was put on the earth just to get America out of the Civil War? Like there's a purpose for him to be here.
Well, I certainly think that was his purpose. But he also, we don't want to forget the other massive achievement, which was the single-handedly, well, not really, but close enough, abolishing slavery in the way that he did. And yes, he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation and freed the slaves in what was then considered, not by Lincoln, but considered by the people there, a foreign country, which didn't mean a whole lot to people until the war ended. But it did change the lives and the trajectory of our country. There's no question about that, as did the Civil War. And I don't think, well, I know that none of the other men who ran for president at the time could have done what Lincoln did. I don't think any of them had the conviction that Lincoln did about slavery. And that was something that changed, because going into it as a politician, he tried to walk a narrow line and say, well, I'm opposed to slavery, but it'll die out on its own. We'll just leave it alone, and it's going to die out because it is a dying institution. And but that all changed, when the war began. It changed everything. And I think it speaks volumes about how other people felt about Lincoln, because so many of the people who ran against him, trying to get the nomination for the presidency, ended up in his cabinet as some of his closest advisors. He had run in 1858 against Stephen Douglas to be a senator from Illinois, and they were opposing viewpoints. But once Lincoln became president, Douglas completely changed his platform as well, and did everything he could to support Lincoln, and was, very, integral to part of his presidency. So I think that Lincoln was inspiring to people, not just today, but at the time as well. And I agree that maybe that wasn't his sole purpose, but no one else could have done it. I just don't believe it.
It's almost like the universe plopped him down. And like it's almost like it's as we always talk about, like candle in the wind, that sort of thing. It just, you have this short spurt, and then you get what you need to get done, and that person passes away. It just seems so like it's almost like a perfect package. And I don't mean that it's not a perfect package. It's very unfortunate, but how it all ended up and whatnot. And that the night of Lincoln going to the theater, was he not close to not going that night?
Well, he had promised Mary that he would go, but he had invited. The problem is that, all the way up into the presidency and to the assassination, there had been omens and foreshadowings for years leading up to these things. And then on the night of that Lincoln had promised to take Mary, it was on Good Friday, and he had a number of people that he invited, and no one would go. All of them had something else going on, or in the case of General Grant, he had invited Ulysses S. Grant and his wife Julia to attend with them, and Julia just said, I don't want to go. I've got a bad feeling about this. And so Grant didn't go. And this is not a guy who was known for superstitions, and, being in that box ended up pretty much ruining the lives of the people who were there that night. Yeah. Major Rathbone eventually lost his mind after murdering, most of his family, or trying to, in this psychotic break that he had. So it was something that, I think Lincoln, was planning to be there and was there. There were so many things it was a perfect storm of things that went wrong that night that led to him, being assassinated, that led to Booth gaining access to his box, something again that should not have happened. A soldier who stepped away, who was found to have done nothing wrong. Had stepped away, and it wasn't his job to be there, because Lincoln didn't have that kind of protection. Ward Layman had been sent to Richmond on an errand for the president. It was almost like it was supposed to happen. Right. And maybe it was. I mean, maybe that's because would Lincoln, and this is just a question. It's a rhetorical question, really, but if you've got an opinion, I'd love to hear it. Mm-hmm. Do you think we would revere Lincoln as much as we do today if he had lived out another 4 years, retired, went home to Springfield, and lived out the rest of his life as a, kind of a guy who used to be famous? I'm not sure that we would.
It's an interesting question. I've thought about that too. I mean, you look at someone like President Washington, who he lived out his life. He was revered and doing great things with the American Revolution. But the thing is that we can only judge someone based on up until that point. Right. And the one thing I always think about too is Winston Churchill, who was key in World War II as a prime minister of the UK. But then in the next election, he lost. He comes back in the 60s and becomes prime minister again, or actually probably 50s. But it's, we don't remember that. We don't talk about that really. We talk about that one moment in time. It's an interesting question, Troy, for sure.
Yeah, I've always wondered about it. If if we would feel the same way, we probably would, but I mean, because his achievements are still with us. But I think that has made definitely us look at Lincoln a different way. And it certainly had us exploring his supernatural side in a way that we would not have. I mean, I don't think if Lincoln had not been assassinated, we'd be talking about his prophetic dreams, obviously. We wouldn't be talking about the omens and things that kind of surrounded his death. And I don't think that he would be nearly as famous of a ghost as he is today. I always like to call him the most well-traveled ghost in American history, based on all the places he supposedly haunts, even though I really only think there's one. But there are so many stories linked to him because of all of the supernatural stuff that surrounded his life.
Some of those dreams that he has had, especially the one where he's walking down the corridor to just come across his own, body in the casket. So vivid and so it's just, and the fact, it's horrible. It's a horrible dream, but I'm so glad that it's been recorded for history. Me too. This is stuff that really helps. And you're right there, because it's not just Lincoln, the great president, it's Lincoln, the mystique. It's just, and we talked about it prior to the show, even in death. The story about his remains it's ridiculous, but also it just doesn't seem to be like surprising considering who we're talking about.
Right. And I think that, the events after his death again has cemented his legend in the way that they have, because never before, and certainly never after in American history, has anybody taken the body of really just about any fallen celebrity, let alone a president, and spent 3 weeks traveling across the country with it, stopping in various cities, putting the body on display. And, literally millions of people turned out to see his body during that trip, and went berserk. People would go out crying and screaming and throwing themselves on the coffin and things. And it changed everything about the way that Americans treated and looked at death up until that point in our history. It changed mourning customs permanently. The things that happened during that particular train trip. And it's not surprising that it made such an impression on the country that not only did it do that, but it also left, the most famous story of a ghost train behind, of reliving this train that took Lincoln on this epic journey. No other president can say anything like that. He made such an impact on our country.
And the fact on this train trip, there's a picture of Teddy Roosevelt as a child watching this.
Right. He and his brother looking out the window of their father's office. Yeah. And it made such an impression on him that, later he would talk about Lincoln's ghost when he was in the White House. He was one of the first presidents that actually talked about, the presence of Lincoln in the White House, because, this one experience from being a child had always had him revere Abraham Lincoln. So.
And if we're talking photographs, just the forewarning, the second inauguration with John Wilkes Booth in the background,
being found in the, watching from, 20 yards away, practically from the president. He could have shot him right there, but he was already, plans were already in the works. The conspiracy had already begun by that time, so it's, there's some amazing stuff.
And it's almost like this is all par for the course for this story. It is such a well-balanced and well-threaded story, and even the fact of on TV in the 1950s, this 90-some-year-old guy is like I on television as part of a game show. I saw some important moment in history, and he was there the night of the assassination as like a 5-year-old or something like that.
Yeah, just a child. Yeah,
unbelievable. This is, and once again, I'm going to just say I've read a lot about this, but Troy, your book, One Night in Washington, folks, you want to pick this up and give it a read and take your time with it and really, really just devour it, really let it sink in. There's so much detail. We have 3 minutes left. And, real fast, how long did it take you to write this book?
It was a little longer than a lot of them, but I guess the beauty of the book is that I'd already had such an interest in Lincoln anyway, and had written snippets of different things, about his funeral train, or I'd written about, the night at Ford's Theater, or I'd written about some of his, his omens, his dream omens and things. So it was really just a matter of putting it all together, trying to keep in the history without getting bogged down in what would be, textbook kind of stuff, finding the more unusual things and trying to keep it moving and entertaining. And that was what I wanted to do, because a lot of times you find with the history in a lot of the books, it will appeal to people who might not read it otherwise. If they know there's the reward of a ghost story or a conspiracy or an unsolved mystery waiting for them down the line, it makes the book a lot more readable. And so that's what I always try to do. And I really enjoyed writing this one. It is one that has stuck with me, and it's one of my favorites. So.
It's one of my favorite books I've ever read, and I'm going to just let folks know we really didn't get to any of the supernatural stuff in this. I'm actually surprised that I didn't take us there more, but
we started, we dipped our toe in it. So
right.
They've got plenty of stuff to find when they pick up the book. Then
you truly do. You will not be disappointed by all the stuff that you've uncovered, and that stuff that, quite frankly, because I didn't think Lincoln was into any of this, that stuff that he did really surprised me. So 100%. That's great.
Well, thank you. So I appreciate it.
Real fast, what's your most recent book?
My most recent book was called The Devil's Carnival, and it was a history of circuses and sideshows and things in American history. So it's a lot of circuses, a lot of midways and fairgrounds, and some of the disasters and the ghost stories left behind by some of those things. That one was a fun one too.
Oh my gosh. I can only imagine. Oh my God. You go there when there is no disaster, and it's kind of scary, some of these places. So I can only imagine. Oh, once again, folks, I want to make sure that you check out AmericanHauntingsInc.com. This is a great website. You can see everything that Troy has written, all of his events and stuff. And honestly, Troy, I hope that you come back. I'd love to talk to you about more of your stuff.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. No, I enjoy this a lot. So yeah, just count me in.
I will. I'm going to hold you to it. Okay.
All right. That's fair.
The book, once again, is called One Night in Washington. You can go ahead, get it over at AmericanHauntingsInc.com. Troy Taylor, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
You too. We'll be back tomorrow, everyone. Have a good night.